The plains of Khet stretched 40 kilometers from the shattered orbital relay station to the mountains the Ninth Combined Arms called the Spine, a jagged black ridge that had no strategic value and enormous psychological value, because it was the only thing on this planet that looked permanent, that looked like it would outlast whatever was coming across the lowlands. General Sorak stood at the forward observation post on the second morning after orbital defense collapse and watched the dust rise on the horizon and said nothing for a long time. The dust was not a storm. There were no storms on Khet in the dry season. The dust was feet. 40 years of warfare across 11 systems had given Sorak a particular quality of stillness. His staff had learned to read it. When he was calculating, he paced. When he was uncertain, he asked questions. When he was still like this, weight forward, hands loose at his sides, the pale secondary eyelids that marked his Varek blood lowered halfway over his dark eyes, he was doing something that had no word in Standard, or in the 6 other languages the Ninth operated across. His half-sister had called it Varek once, a lifetime ago, before she died on a different world for a faith he had rejected. It translated roughly as the moment of knowing the shape of the killing to come. He did not use the word. He had not used many Varek words in 20 years. Numbers, he said. Colonel Viss, his chief of staff, full human, from a water world, who had never in his career stopped being slightly alarmed by Sorak's face, pulled up the drone analysis on her wrist display. Best estimate is 200,000 ground assault infantry. Armored elements behind them, we can't get a clear count through the dust signature. Heavy artillery mounted on the crawler platforms, at least 40, possibly more. She paused. The Sev Battalion is requesting permission to begin evacuation of the eastern position. Denied. General. The eastern position is the only thing keeping their armored column from flanking the spine. If the Sev pull back, we lose the ridge in 6 hours and the fortress city in 20. He turned from the plane. In the light of Khet's pale sun, the Varek markings on his face, the ritual scarification along his jawline and cheekbones, faded but indelible, that he had received at age 7 in a ceremony whose prayers he still knew perfectly, were very clear. Viss had served with him for 8 years and still sometimes could not look at them directly. Tell the Sev they hold. Tell them if they hold through the first assault wave, I will personally recommend every soldier in that battalion for the Confederation Medal. And if they ask what happens during the second wave, tell them we'll discuss it after the first. The 9th Combined Arms had been assembled 18 months ago from the remnants of 7 different units shattered across the retreat from the Varek advance through the Kessel systems. It was not, by any conventional measure, a cohesive fighting force. The Sev were aquatic by evolution, adapted to pressure and darkness, and fought brilliantly in enclosed spaces and poorly in open terrain under direct light. The Marak contingent, 400 soldiers of a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescent skin patterns and experienced combat as a collective emotional state rather than individual decision-making, were devastating in coordinated assaults and dangerously unpredictable when their unit cohesion broke. The Dren, heavy gravity adapted, each massing 3 times a human soldier, were the regiment's shock troops and its slowest movers, and they had a cultural relationship with the concept of ground holding that made them nearly impossible to retreat even when retreat was tactically correct. There were 200 Heth, silicon-based, who did not experience pain in any way humans understood and whose bravery was therefore not bravery but simple absence of a certain kind of signal, and who had never satisfactorily explained to any human colleague what, if anything, they feared. There were the full humans, 40% of the regiment, the backbone of staff and support functions, carrying the institutional knowledge of warfare that the other species sometimes had and sometimes did not. And there were, scattered through every unit, perhaps 300 soldiers of mixed species heritage, the genetic negotiations of a century of interstellar contact, who fit cleanly into no single category and found in the 9th's particular chaos something that felt, if not like home, then like the nearest available approximation. Among these last was Corporal Caro, assigned to 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, which was positioned on the forward slope of the spine with a clear line of sight to the relay station ruins 3 kilometers out. Caro was 26 years old. He was built like a human except for the secondary skeletal structure along his spine that gave his back its unusual rigidity and the pale secondary eyelids and the markings on his face, lighter than Sorak's, less precisely cut, the markings of a child whose Varek parent had made the cuts at home rather than in ceremony, because that parent had already half left the faith and could not bring herself to take him to the temples. He had grown up in a Confederation border colony knowing what he was and not quite knowing what that meant. He had enlisted at 18 because the Varek advance was moving toward his colony and there had seemed, in that moment, to be no ambiguity about the correct response. He had not, at 18, fully understood what it would mean to fight them. He had not, in the 6 years since, stopped trying to figure it out. He was checking his weapon for the 4th time when Sergeant Ollo settled in beside him on the slope, full human, Olo, from somewhere agricultural, big-handed and unhurried, who had the quality of a person who has accepted the terms of his life without resentment and finds in this acceptance a kind of freedom. Dust is getting thicker, Olo said. Yes. You can see it from here. That's a lot of them. Yes. Olo was quiet for a moment. You doing all right, Caro? I'm fine. You've checked that rifle 4 times. I like to be sure. Olo nodded slowly, in the way of a man deciding not to push. Caro was grateful for this. He was not, in any sense he could articulate, fine. What he was feeling was not fear, or not only fear, but something more complicated, a religious vertigo that he had no language for because he had been raised in the half-faith of a woman who had left without fully leaving, and the faith had never given him clean doctrine, only fragments, and the fragments were stirring now the way they always stirred when the Varek were close enough to see. The Varek believed they were killing the universe toward its perfect state. Caro had grown up hearing this at half volume, in his mother's voice when she thought he was asleep, the old prayers that she could not quite give up because giving them up entirely felt like losing the last piece of a person she had once been. He had grown up with the cadences of divine certainty in the background of everything and the Confederation's secular military doctrine in the foreground, and he had told himself he believed, that the doctrine was correct and the cadences were wrong. But the Varek did not stop. They had never stopped. And watching their dust rise on the plains of Khet on the second morning after orbital collapse, Corporal Caro felt the old question move through him like something waking. What if the certainty is what winning looks like? He checked his rifle a 5th time. Then he made himself stop. He did not let himself look toward the command post on the ridge above, where he knew General Sorak was standing. He had been avoiding looking at Sorak since the regiment reached Khet. He was not sure what he was afraid of seeing. The first wave hit the eastern position at dawn on the 3rd day. Sorak had expected them to begin with artillery. The Varek tactical doctrine that he had grown up studying, that he had, as a child, been told he would one day execute, called for prolonged suppression fire before ground advance, a softening of defenses that was as much psychological as physical, because the sound of sustained bombardment was itself a weapon against the faithless, against those who had not achieved the state of Vardesh, the divine indifference to death that Varek warriors spent years training toward. He had positioned his regiment accordingly, with hardened positions and deep bunkers, expecting the bombardment to last 3 to 6 hours. The bombardment lasted 11 minutes. They're ahead of their own doctrine, Vis said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite panic but was adjacent to it. No. Sorak watched the assault lines forming on his command display, the Varek infantry emerging from the dust at a pace that was not a march and not a run but something between them, something with the quality of a tide. They're past doctrine. They know how long we have before Confederation relief arrives and they're not going to give it to us. He opened the regimental channel. All positions, this is Sorak. The assault is beginning. You have trained for this. You know what you are doing. Hold your positions until my order. Do not, I repeat, do not engage until they are within confirmed range. He paused. They will not stop when they take casualties. You know this. Do not let it affect your fire discipline. Do your jobs. He closed the channel. Honest assessment, Vis said quietly. Not now. General. After the first wave, Vis. Right now I need you tracking the armored elements on the northern approach. The Varek infantry came across the plain in what Sorak recognized as the 3rd formation of cleansing, a doctrine he had memorized at age 9, a wide front assault with the elite strike units positioned at the center rear, held back for exploitation of any gap that the forward lines opened. The forward lines were not expected to survive. They were not intended to survive. They were the first wave in the theological sense as well as the tactical one, the opening gift to the universe, the first installment of the great offering. They advanced without cover, without suppression, without any of the tactical behaviors that armies use when their soldiers fear dying. They advanced because they did not fear dying. They advanced because dying here, in this assault, on this plain, was the achievement of their lives' purpose, and every soldier in that front line had been waiting for this moment since childhood, had been trained toward it, had dreamed of it, and felt in this moment not fear but something close to joy. The 9th opened fire at 800 meters. The front line of the Varek assault absorbed the fire and kept coming. This was the first thing that broke soldiers who had never fought the Varek before. Not the numbers. Numbers were numbers, and training prepared you for numbers, but the quality of the advance under fire, the way the Varek dead fell and the living stepped over them without breaking stride, without the instinctive flinch that any other enemy would show, without any signal at all that the killing was affecting their intention. The Marak contingent on the southern flank, whose bioluminescent communication pattern Sorak had learned to read over 18 months, blazed briefly with the deep spectrum violet that indicated collective distress, and then he watched it on the command display, the patterns shifting, the unit cohesion wavering, went dark in the way that meant they had stopped communicating entirely, which was worse. Marak command, this is Sorak. Report. Silence for 3 seconds. Then the Marak unit commander, whose name translated approximately as the sound water makes finding a stone and who was addressed in the regiment as Stone, said in his careful standard, "We are holding, General. We are." A pause. "They are very many." "I know. Hold your line. I need you for another 40 minutes. "Yes, General." The Varek front line reached the forward positions at 600 meters and the fighting became close, brutal, grinding, the kind of engagement where training and physical courage mattered more than any amount of tactical doctrine. The Dren, heavy and slow and impossible to move from ground they had chosen to hold, became the anchor points around which the rest of the eastern line organized itself, 3-meter bodies that the Varek assault broke against again without effect, the Dren not retreating and the Varek not stopping, a collision of two different kinds of refusal. Between them and around them, the human soldiers and the Sev and the mixed-species contingent fought in the way that soldiers who are afraid but trained fight, controlled, disciplined, burning through fear by replacing it with procedure, with the next task and the next task and the next. On the spine, in the forward position of 3rd Company, Corporal Caro fought in the way that he had always fought, which was very well. This was something he had discovered about himself in 6 years of war, that his body, regardless of what was happening in his mind, was very good at the work. His hands were steady. His aim was clean. He made decisions quickly and correctly. Sergeant Ollo, beside him, watched this with the quiet satisfaction of an experienced soldier watching a younger one come through, and did not know, because Caro had never told anyone, that what was happening in Caro's mind during battle was not the simplified focus that most soldiers described but a continuous doubled awareness, the Confederation soldier doing his job and, beneath it, running on some deeper track, the half-faith child listening to the sound of the Varek advance and hearing. In it the rhythms of the prayers he had grown up with, the cadences of the Vardesh given physical form in the sound of feet that did not stop. The first wave broke against the 9th's line and fell back, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in the tactical sense of having spent itself, the frontline soldiers achieving their deaths and the assault line pulling back to allow the second wave to organize. This was in the doctrine. Sorak had explained it in the regimental briefing 3 days ago. The Varek do not retreat. They cycle. The front wave dies. The next wave comes. There is no point at which they run out of waves. Casualties, Sorak said. This read them. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were bad. Eastern position. Holding. The Sev took heavy casualties on the southern end of the line. The Dren are intact. Marak cohesion is degraded but functional. Time to second wave. Drone analysis shows them organizing now. 40 minutes, possibly less. Sorak looked at the plane. The Varek dead lay on it in the particular stillness of soldiers who had died reaching for something, bodies oriented toward the enemy line even in death, as if the Vardesh persisted past the moment of dying. He had grown up being told that it did. He had spent 20 years not thinking about what he believed. "Get me the artillery coordinates for the northern crawler platforms," he said. "And tell the Sev their medal recommendation stands." They came again at midday. The second wave was larger. This was also in the doctrine, each successive wave drawing more deeply from the assault force, the offering increasing, the gift to the universe expanding. Sorak had repositioned the Marak contingent to the center during the 40-minute break, pulling them back from the flank where their cohesion had been under strain and putting them behind the main line where their collective assault capacity could be used offensively if the Varek found a gap. He had moved 2 of the Dren heavy units to reinforce the southern end of the eastern position where the Sev had taken losses. He had walked the line personally during the break, not for any tactical reason but because he had learned, over 40 years, that soldiers who had seen their general's face before the second assault held differently than soldiers who had only heard his voice. He had stopped in front of 3rd Company on the spine and found Caro there, and for a moment their eyes had met, Sorak's dark, half-lidded, with a faded scarification of the old ceremonies, and Caro's lighter, younger, with the marks his mother had made, and Caro had looked away first. Sorak had noted this and moved on. The second wave hit all positions simultaneously. This was a departure from standard Varek doctrine, which staggered its assaults to probe for weakness before committing. It meant one of two things. Either the assault commander had seen something in the first wave's data that suggested simultaneous pressure would break the line, or the assault commander had decided that tactical doctrine was no longer the primary objective. Sorak, watching the assault lines materialize from the dust in a wide front that covered all 40 kilometers of the defensive position, thought it was probably the second. They had seen his face on the drone imagery. Someone in the assault command had recognized him. He kept this thought to himself. The second wave was harder. The 9th had expended ammunition, energy cells, and the particular resource that had no official name in military logistics but that every experienced soldier accounted for, the first wave expenditure of fear. Soldiers who have been afraid once and come through it arrive at the second assault slightly different. Some of them harder, some of them more brittle, the distribution impossible to predict in advance. The Dren were harder. 3 of the Marak subunits had gone brittle in the way Sorak had feared, their bioluminescent communication patterns becoming chaotic, individual soldiers diverging from the collective state that was their species' primary combat coordination mechanism. He had to pull 2 of those subunits back from the line and replace them with human infantry, which thinned the center. On the spine, 3rd Company held the high ground and provided covering fire for the eastern position below, and Caro fought with a mechanical cleanliness that had always characterized him, the doubled awareness running beneath it, the soldier on the surface and, below, the half-faith mind cataloguing the Varek advance in the language it had learned in childhood, noting the formations, recognizing the doctrine, feeling in the rhythms of the assault the shape of something he could not name. He killed 12 Varek soldiers in the second wave. He knew this precisely because he counted, always counted, had counted since his first engagement 6 years ago for a reason he had never examined because examining it would mean asking himself what the number meant. The second wave crested and fell back. The 9th had held. Olo looked at Caro across a broken section of forward wall and said, in the tone of a man reporting whether third wave is going to be worse. I know. You look tired. I'm not. I know you're not. I said you look it. Olo checked his own rifle, quickly and practically, without the recursive quality that Caro's checking had. You want to tell me what you're actually thinking about? No. Olo accepted this. He had learned, in 18 months with Caro, that some of the not telling was protection of the teller and some of it was protection of the listener and that it was not always easy to tell which was which. He had a theory about Caro, about the markings and what they meant and what it cost a man to be wearing them on this particular battlefield, but he kept the theory to himself because Caro had never offered him the opening and he was not the kind of man to force one. The third wave hit 2 hours later. Then the fourth, before the third's casualties could be cleared. Then the fifth wave at dusk, under the red-grey sky of Khet's evening, the dust turning the horizon into something that looked, to those who had grown up on worlds with mythology, like the end of everything. The Marak contingent broke on the fifth wave. Not in a tactical sense, they did not flee, they did not abandon their positions, but in the cohesion sense, the collective consciousness that allowed them to fight as a single distributed entity fragmenting under the cumulative pressure of 4 waves of Varek assault, the bioluminescent patterns going dark individually across the unit like lights going out in a building, until the Marak were fighting as individuals, each alone in the way that their species found most terrible, each soldier experiencing the assault not as a shared state but as a private catastrophe. They still fought. Marak individuals, severed from collective cohesion, fought with a desperation that was different in quality from what they did in coordination, less efficient, more violent, burning harder and lasting less long. Sorak pulled them from the line and replaced them with his last reserve infantry, 200 humans from the regimental support battalion who had spent 3 days moving ammunition and were not rested. He did not have any other option. He walked the command post and Vis tracked everything and did not tell him what the casualty numbers were saying because she did not need to and because some numbers are better understood as shapes than as figures. Reinforcement timeline, he said. Confederation relief force is 41 hours out. And the Varek. Current assault tempo is unsustainable for their forces as well. They are taking significant casualties. They don't care about their casualties. I know, General. I know. He stood at the edge of the command post and looked at the plane in the last light and thought about 41 hours and what the regiment would look like at the end of them and whether the regiment would exist at the end of them, and he did this without the stillness that his staff associated with his worst calculations, with something more like the expression of a man doing arithmetic on a debt. The sixth wave came before full dark. It was different. The Varek standard assault doctrine cycled frontline waves in a broad front push. The sixth wave was not broad front. It was narrow, concentrated, a spear driven toward the center of the line, toward the position that the Varek tactical intelligence had identified from 6 waves of engagement and 4 days of drone imagery as the location of the 9th Combined Arms Command element. Toward the ridge. Toward Sorak. He recognized it the moment the pattern appeared on the command display. The 9th rite of specific devotion, the targeted assault on an individual of theological significance, an operation that the Varek did not deploy for military objectives but for what their doctrine described as sacred necessities. He had studied it as a child. He had been told, as a child, what categories of being required it. "This," he said, very quietly. "I see it, General. Pull the command element back to secondary position. Move the staff now." "What about you?" "I'm staying." He turned to face her, and the expression on his face, the secondary eyelids fully raised, the scarification pale against his darker skin, stopped her objection before she made it. "The command element is the target. If I move with it, I'm handing them 1,000 soldiers' worth of tactical sacrifice for one theological objective. The secondary position is in the middle of the regiment's line. I'm not putting them in the middle of this." He looked at his staff. 12 people, human and mixed, who had been with him in various configurations for years. "You all move. Take the communications array. I'll operate from the forward post." You can't command a regiment from a forward post with no staff. "I've done more with less. Move, this." "That's an order." She moved. They all moved, with the efficiency of trained soldiers and the particular quality of trained soldiers who are moving away from their commanding officer into safety while he stays behind, which is an efficiency that feels like something else entirely. The last one out was a young human signals officer named Perret who turned at the door and looked at Sorak and then turned back and left. Sorak was alone in the forward command post with a communications array and a weapon he had not personally fired in 3 years. The Varek 9th Right assault came across the plain in the dark. There were 40 of them. This number was precise. The 9th Right was prescribed in Varek doctrine with a specificity that most military doctrine did not approach, because it was not military doctrine but liturgical instruction, and liturgical instruction held to its numbers. 40 warriors of the Varketh Harad, the order of sacred completion, the Varek equivalent of special forces, except that the selection criterion was not physical or cognitive capacity but theological purity, the demonstrated achievement of the Vardesh state, the absolute indifference to one's own death. The 40 had been selected from the assault force before the first wave. They had spent 6 waves waiting. Their patience was not tactical patience. It was devotional patience, the patience of those who have achieved stillness at the center of a storm. Sorak watched them come on the forward post's optical array, 40 shapes moving through the dark with the quality of people walking toward a destination they have always known, and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not fear exactly but its religious antecedent, the feeling he associated with the temples of his childhood, the Varketh state entering him through some channel he thought he had closed 20 years ago. He let himself feel it for exactly as long as it took to check his weapon, and then he put it away. The Varketh Harad did not use artillery or suppression. They used their bodies and their blades and the firearms they carried as secondary tools, because the 9th Right was not about efficiency. It was about contact. It was about the apostate knowing, in the last moment of his life, that he was being reclaimed not by impersonal force but by the devoted, that the universe was correcting itself through the hands of the faithful. They came through the forward position's outer perimeter at 2,200 hours, and Sorak was already out of the command post. He had fought the Varek for 30 years and had spent the last 20 of them as their enemy, and he knew their doctrine better than most of their own commanders because he had been trained in it from birth and had never stopped studying it even after rejecting it, the way that a person who has left a faith sometimes cannot stop being interested in its texts. He knew the 9th Right advance pattern. He knew where the flankers would be and where the center would concentrate and what the 3 lead warriors would do in the first 5 seconds of contact. He moved through the dark of the forward position like a man navigating a familiar space with the lights off, and when the first of the Varketh Harad came around the corner of the eastern bunker he was already positioned and the man was dead before he understood that Sorak was there. The second came faster. Sorak had been a trained warrior before he was a commander, and the body keeps things that the mind has tried to set aside, and what his body had kept was the Varek style of close combat, the Varketh fighting doctrine, designed not for survival but for the delivery of death, which was a different optimization that happened to be very effective when wielded by a man who also wanted to survive. He moved through the Varek style the way a speaker moves through a first language, not translating, not thinking, the words arriving already shaped, and the 3rd and 4th of the Harad died in the spaces between his movements and he took a cut along his left arm that he registered and set aside because setting pain aside was also something his body had kept. They regrouped. This was not in the 9th Right doctrine. The doctrine did not anticipate the apostate being capable of the response Sorak was making, because the doctrine had been written before Sorak, but the Harad were not only doctrinally trained, they were militarily trained, and the surviving 36 organized themselves with a speed that told him they had updated their approach. He retreated to the command post's interior. Small space. Limited angles. The Harad blades were longer than his weapon in close quarters. He calculated and found that the calculation did not resolve cleanly, and allowed himself exactly 1 second to acknowledge this and then stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not useful. What he had, in the small space of the forward command post with 36 Varek elites outside, was the communications array. It was still active. He had left it active deliberately. He had been thinking about the communications array since the moment he recognized the 9th Right assault pattern on his display, 6 hours ago, before he sent his staff away, before he checked his weapon, before he moved out into the dark to kill 4 of the 40. He had been thinking about it in the way that he thought about tactical problems, not linearly, not as a sequence of planned steps, but as a shape held in the mind while other shapes moved around it, the way a stone stays still at the bottom of moving water. What he knew, and had always known, and had not thought about in 20 years because thinking about it felt like something he did not want to feel, was the prayer. The Varketh Hara, the prayer of completion, spoken at the moment of a Varek warrior's death in battle. The prayer that acknowledged the gift of the warrior's life to the universe, that confirmed the universe's receipt of the offering, that named the dead as having achieved the highest possible state of being. He had grown up knowing it. His mother had prayed it over his aunt's body when news came from a distant campaign. He had heard it in the temples. He had heard it in dreams. He had heard it during the 6 waves of the Varek assault on Khet, each wave withdrawing with its dead and its prayers, the sound of it carrying on the wind from the plain to the ridge, the cadences landing in him with a precision that 20 years had not blunted. He knew it the way he knew his own name. The 9th combined arms held through the 6th wave and the 7th at the cost of the regiment's shape. Not its existence. The regiment existed, it held its line, the spine was still in human hands and the eastern position had not broken, but the configuration of it, the way it had looked 3 days ago when Sorak had walked the line, was gone. The Sev were down to 40% strength. The Marak were effectively non-functional as a unit and were being used in pairs as individual supplementary infantry, disconnected and diminished. The Dren held everywhere the Dren were positioned, because the Dren held everywhere they positioned themselves and would hold until they died, which several of them had done. The human infantry had absorbed everything that every other unit could not absorb and had done this with the stubborn, frightened, professional competence that human soldiers had always brought to impossible situations, and were running short on the resource that had no name. Caro fought through the 6th and 7th waves from the spine and did not know, during these hours, what was happening at the forward command post because communications discipline kept non-essential signals traffic off the tactical net and the assault on the command post was not being broadcast as non-essential, it was not being broadcast at all because Sorak had sent his staff away. Caro knew that something had changed in the tactical command rhythm, the orders were slower, the confirmation cycles missing the intermediate staff layer, but in the 7th wave there was too much immediately in front of him for this observation to become a thought he had time to finish. He had killed 31 Varek soldiers. He knew the number exactly. He had not stopped counting and had not stopped, beneath the counting, performing the half-faith liturgical gesture his mother had taught him without knowing she was teaching it, the small movement of his left hand that was the Varek sign for acknowledgement of the offered, a gesture that said, "I see what you gave." He did not know if he was making it for the dead or for himself. He had not examined this. Sergeant Ollo was hit in the 7th wave, not fatally, a shard hit to the left shoulder that took him off the firing line and into the aid position behind the crest of the spine, and Caro was briefly alone in the forward position in a way that he had not been since the 1st wave, and in the brief strange silence between the 7th wave's withdrawal and the organization of the 8th he looked out at the plain and did something he had been not doing for 4 days. He looked at the forward command post. The fighting around it was visible even at this distance. The Harad was 40 figures in the dark, identifiable by their movement patterns, the contained violence of trained killers in a fixed position, and at the center of it Caro could infer from the pattern of the engagement, from the way the 40 had not consolidated to a single point, from the fighting shape, a single figure that was not retreating. Sorak. Caro had been refusing to look at Sorak. He had been refusing because looking at Sorak felt, in ways he could not entirely construct into coherent thought, like a theological act, like looking at the text of an argument he was not sure he wanted to have. An apostate. A man who had left the faith and spent 20 years fighting it. A man with the sacred marks of the Varketh on his face who used them as a general use as a battlefield, to read and to think and to command, stripped of everything they were supposed to mean. Caro had watched Sorak walk the line between the 3rd and 4th waves and had looked away when their eyes met because he had been afraid, not of Sorak, but of what he would see in Sorak's face. Some confirmation or denial. He had not known which would be worse. He watched the forward post now and saw the single figure still moving. He was on his feet before he had made any decision. The Varketh Harad came through the command post entrance in groups of 3, which was the prescribed entry formation of the 9th Right, and Sorak met them in the formations he expected, in the small space that limited their long blades and extended the effectiveness of his shorter weapon, and he was very good at this and had the additional advantage of knowing, precisely, what each 3 group would do in its first and second and third seconds of contact. He killed 9 more of the 40 in this way. He took 3 more wounds that he registered and set aside. His left arm was becoming a problem. His body was 47 years old and had been at this for 11 minutes and was doing the work but not without cost. The Harad that remained, 27, now, from 40, pulled back from the command post entrance in a way that told him their team structure had something he hadn't anticipated. The senior warrior among them, there was always one, the right holder, the one whose death at the apostate's hands would constitute the ritual completion if the apostate somehow survived the 40, was reassessing. Sorak heard the movement patterns reorganize and thought, they're going to burn it. The command post was hardened against standard incendiaries. It was not hardened against the Varek Varketh burners, devotional weapons, technically prohibited by the Confederation rules of engagement and therefore not hardened against because no one had thought they would be used on a ground assault, because the Varketh burners were temple weapons, used in cleansing rites, used on sacred sites, on apostates. He had perhaps 3 minutes before the building became untenable. He moved to the communications array. Outside, the battle was still happening across all 40 kilometers of the 9th's line. The 8th wave was organizing on the plain. The regiment was holding by the width of the line that the Dren were still occupying and not much else. Sorak could see it all on the command display, could see the shape of the 9th, thinner than 3 days ago and concentrated into its strongest remaining elements, holding the line with the geometry of a force that has been reduced to its irreducible core. They were still there. They had given him 41 hours, or close enough. He thought, this is what I have. He thought, it is enough to work with. He opened the Varek religious broadcast frequencies, military channels, not civilian, the ones the assault force used for internal communication of sacred rites, and sat down at the array and breathed once, slowly. The breath that his mother had taught him preceded the Varketh Hara, the settling breath, the breath that said to the body, now we are in the sacred. He said the prayer. He said it in Old Varek, in the accent of the Eastern temples where he had grown up, in the voice he had learned the prayer in, his mother's voice, his teacher's voices, the voices of the faithful at the moment of completion. He said it without hesitation or error, every word placed exactly where the liturgy placed it, every pause held to the prescribed length, every cadence given its proper weight. He said it for the dead of the Varketh Harad, naming their achievement without irony and without contempt, naming what they had done and what they had given and what they had become in the giving, and his voice on the Varek sacred channels carried across the plain of Khet to every unit in the assault force simultaneously. The building began to fill with smoke from the Varketh burners. He said the prayer. Outside, the Harad had stopped moving. He finished the prayer and sat in the smoke and breathed and waited. What happened next he had not been certain would happen, because certainty in tactical decisions was a luxury he had given up at roughly the same time he gave up the faith. He had believed it might work because he understood, at a level that could not be reduced to tactical analysis, what the prayer meant to the people hearing it. He had been one of them once. He knew what it felt like to hear the Varketh Hara, the specific quality of stillness it produced, the way the theological frame of the Varek understanding of death in battle made the prayer's completion a kind of event horizon, a moment after which the universe had been altered in a specific way and everything that followed had to acknowledge the alteration. The prayer of completion, spoken correctly, at the correct moment, over the dead of the 9th Rite, spoken by the apostate they had come to kill, spoken in the voice of the temples, spoken without error, was not a military signal. It was a theological one. It said, the offering has been received. The rite is complete. The universe has acknowledged. The Varketh doctrine did not provide, in this contingency, a clear next instruction. Because this contingency did not exist in the doctrine. The apostate was supposed to die. The Harad was supposed to kill him and speak the prayer over his body, and the rite was supposed to complete in the conventional direction. Instead, the apostate was speaking the prayer. The apostate was completing the rite. The Varketh doctrine, in this silence, had nothing further to say. Sorak sat in the smoke of the burning command post and listened. The shooting stopped. Not on part of the line. On all of it. 40 kilometers of engagement, the 8th wave organized and crossing the plain, the Harad at the command post entrance, the artillery on the northern crawlers, all of it stopped, in a period of perhaps 30 seconds, with the quality of sound ceasing rather than being cut off, the way a prayer ends rather than the way a broadcast is interrupted. The silence was enormous. Sorak got up from the communications array and walked through the smoke to the command post entrance and stepped out into the dark air of Khet's night. The Varketh Harad were standing in the courtyard of the forward position. 27 of them, blades held, not attacking and not sheathing, occupying the space between states with the absolute stillness of those who have been given no instruction for this moment. The right holder, a figure taller than the rest, scarification more extensive, the marks of high devotion visible even in the dark, stood at the center of the group and looked at Sorak with an expression that Sorak recognized because he had spent 7 years learning to make it. The right holder looked uncertain. It was, on a Varek warrior's face, the most devastating thing Sorak had ever seen. They stood in silence. The smoke drifted out of the command post behind Sorak and dissipated in the night air. On the plain, nothing moved. 40 kilometers of war had stopped while two men looked at each other across 20 meters and neither of them had any doctrine left. The right holder sheathed his blade. He turned. The other 26 turned with him. They walked back across the plain toward the Varek lines, and as they walked the larger shapes of the assault force, the 8th wave still on the plain, the armored elements on the northern approach, the artillery crawlers, began to move with them. Slowly, with the quality of something very large changing direction, the entire Varek assault force began to withdraw. It took a long time. The plain was very full of them. Sorak stood at the edge of the forward position and watched them go, and the smoke from the burning section of the command post rose behind him into the dark sky of Khet, and the 9th Combined Arms, across 40 kilometers of battered line, stood in positions they had held for 4 days and watched the Varek leave and did not, for a long moment, do anything at all. Sorak became aware of a presence to his left. He looked. Corporal Caro was standing 4 meters away, rifle in his hands, breathing hard from what had clearly been a fast movement across the ridge. He had arrived, Sorak calculated from the position and the breathing, sometime during the prayer. He had heard it. He was standing with the expression of a man who has seen something he did not have a framework for and is in the process of building one, the expression not of revelation but of its aftermath, when the thing that has been revealed has not yet resolved into understanding but has already finished being something that can be denied. He was looking at the retreating Varek. He was looking at Sorak. He was looking at the marks on Sorak's face, and Sorak, who never thought about the marks, thought about them now. The scarification of the temples, given to him at 7 years old by hands that had believed in what they were doing, that had been marking him as a vessel of divine purpose, that had not known they were marking a man who would spend his life doing something they could not have imagined. And he did not look away from Caro's examination, and Caro did not look away from his. The Varek moved across the plain in the dark, and their dust rose and fell. Caro opened his mouth and closed it. He was not a man who spoke when he had nothing to say, and he had nothing to say, or rather he had too many things to say and none of them were ready to be words. There was something working in his face, a resolution, or the beginning of one, the kind that happens when something that has been uncertain for a long time becomes, not certain, but differently configured, changed in the way that a weight changes when you put it down, not lighter but no longer yours to carry in that way. He looked at Sorak for a long time. He did not look afraid. The word that Sorak's half-sister had used, Varek, the knowing of the shape of the killing to come, was imprecise as a translation, and most of what was imprecise about it was that the word killing did not quite cover what the original meant, which was closer to the shape of what is coming, without specification of its nature. The Varek state was available, in the original theology, not only before violence but before any moment that would alter everything after it. Sorak had spent 20 years using only the tactical fraction of the word. Standing on the plain of Khet with the Varek retreating into the dark and a half-faith corporal looking at him with eyes that were not afraid, he felt the fuller meaning of it arrive in him like something returning rather than something new. He became aware that he was bleeding from 3 places and that his left arm was going to need attention before the adrenaline finished metabolizing. He became aware of the regiment, stretched across 40 kilometers, beginning to make the sounds that regiments make when the immediate danger has passed. Not celebration, nothing that clean, but the tentative auditory reconstruction of a force establishing that it still exists, still occupies space, still has a future tense. He became aware of Colonel Viss on the command channel, her voice professional and controlled in the way of a person who has been very frightened and is not going to show it now, reporting that the Varek forces were confirming withdrawal on all sectors, that the 8th wave had turned back, that the artillery crawlers were moving north, that the Confederation Relief Force had received their communications and confirmed they were 40 hours and 20 minutes out. He keyed the regimental channel. "This is Sorak." His voice was even. His voice was always even. "The Varek are withdrawing. All positions hold your lines and await confirmation of full withdrawal before standing down. Medical teams to the forward positions. Ammunition resupply beginning in 20 minutes. He paused. "The 9th held Khet. I want you to know that I know exactly what that cost. I know what you gave for this ridge and this plain and this world you've never seen before and will probably never see again. I know it." Another pause, in which the sounds of the regiment on the channel, the breathing, the background noise of positions that are beginning to relax, were the closest thing to music he had heard in 4 days. "Stand by for further orders." He closed the channel. Caro was still there. Sorak looked at him. The corporal's face in the light of Khet's moons, two of them, small and fast, crossing the sky in opposite directions, was the face of a young man who has been fighting for 6 years and is in the process of understanding something he has been in the process of understanding his whole life. The marks on it were lighter than Sorak's, less precisely placed, the work of a mother's hands rather than a temple's instruments, but they were the same marks. They said the same things, in the same language, whether or not the people wearing them still spoke that language. Sorak did not say anything. He had said what there was to say on the regimental channel, or as much of it as could be said on a channel with 1,000 listeners, and what remained was not speech. What remained was the plain and the night and the marks on two faces and the retreating sound of an army that had stopped because a man they were trying to kill had spoken the words they had all been taught to hold sacred. What remained was the question that Caro had been carrying since he was old enough to understand what his mother's half-faith had given him and what it had withheld, the question that Sorak had answered in the only way that question can be answered, which is not with argument or doctrine or the resolution of competing claims about the nature of the universe, but with the shape of what you do when everything is on the line and the only thing you have left is what you actually believe. Sorak looked at the plain. Caro looked at Sorak. The Varek moved away into the dark, their dust settling, their prayers, if they were praying, and some of them were, because they were people with a faith and a crisis in that faith and no doctrine for what had just happened to them. Unheard at this distance, private, each warrior carrying the evening's impossible event in the only place it could be carried, which was alone. The 9th Combined Arms held the line they had held for 4 days and stood in the first quiet they had known and were still there, still breathing, the irreducible core of a regiment that had been reduced very far and not all the way, still on the ground they had been given to hold. Caro lowered his rifle. It was a small movement. It was the movement of a man putting something down. He did not look afraid anymore. He looked like a man who has been afraid for a long time and has reached the end of the particular fear that has been running beneath everything, the fear not of death or injury or the Varek advance but of the answer to a question he had been asking since childhood, and has found that the answer, now that it has arrived, is something he can stand on. Not comfortable. Not simple. Something like the spine behind them, jagged and black and permanent, the only thing on this planet that looked like it would outlast everything. He looked at Sorak one more time. He turned and walked back up the slope. Sorak watched him go. The moons of Khet crossed each other in the sky above the plain and moved on in their opposite directions, fast and small, each one alone in its orbit, and the smoke from the burning section of the command post thinned and dispersed in the dry night air of a world that would be in Confederation hands by morning, that would be a footnote in the history of a war that was not yet over, that 41 hours from now would receive a relief force that would find a ridge held and an eastern position. Held and a plain full of Varek dead lying in the particular stillness of soldiers who had died reaching for something. In the distance, moving into the dark, the Varek carried their dead with them and their prayers and the question that an apostate's voice had placed inside their doctrine, the question that had no answer in the liturgy, that the Varketh Hara spoken in an enemy's voice had opened like a door in a wall they had believed was solid, a door that most of them would spend the rest of their lives not going through and a few of them, eventually, would. This too was in the nature of things. The universe, the Varek believed, was moving toward its perfect state. Sorak, who had left that belief 20 years ago and carried its cadences and its prayers and its deepest grammar in the body he had spent 20 years fighting with, thought sometimes that the belief was not wrong about the movement, only about what the destination looked like. He turned from the plain. He had a regiment to put back together and 40 hours to do it in. He went to find his staff.